Welcome to HOA Justice Stories. The certified envelope showed up like a threat. You are about to get another fee. That was what Joan Collins shouted at me in the parking lot of Beacon Hill Estates Association, her pink windbreaker snapping in the wind, thin reading glasses perched on her nose for maximum dramatic effect. She was waving a service invoice packet at me like it was a court summons. The past incident was settled and she did not want it reopened, which made me want it reopened. I stood there with my car key fob clenched in my fist, my white hoodie flapping in the gusts that rattled the loose paper packets she was holding. I am a building maintenance technician in Missoula, Montana, and I know every rule and every loophole in the Beacon Hill Estates rulebook. Joan is the gate access administrator, which means she controls the entry codes, the guest parking permits, and the tow authorization slips. She has been using that power like a weapon for as long as I have lived here. The violation notice she handed me was dated 3 days ago, but I never saw it on my door. It claimed my car was parked in a guest spot overnight, which was a lie. I park in my assigned spot every single night because my job has strict shift hours and I cannot afford to get towed. The notice had a 48-hour deadline to pay a $200 fine or face towing. The deadline was tomorrow morning at 8. Joan put her hands on her hips and said, "This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive. You will pay the fee or your car will be gone by 9. I looked at the invoice packet again. The format was odd. The letterhead was correct, but the body text looked like it had been copied and pasted from an older template. The violation code was listed as G14, which I knew was retired 2 years ago and replaced with G22. I asked her why the notice used an outdated code. She blinked, adjusted her glasses, and said the system auto-generated it and she was not responsible for software errors. She said I could appeal after I paid, but the tow company had already been notified and they would be on standby tomorrow morning. She turned and walked toward her car, a golf cart with a blinking amber light that she uses to patrol the neighborhood like she is dispatch. I stood there in the wind, staring at the notice. Something about it felt wrong. Not just wrong, but familiar. I remembered hearing about a similar case 2 years ago, right before I moved in. A guy named Eric had been hit with a surprise tow notice over a guest parking violation that he swore never happened. He fought it, but the association backed Joan, and he ended up paying over $600 in fines and tow fees just to get his car back. He moved out 3 months later. I never thought much about it at the time, but now, holding this notice with the outdated code and the impossible timeline, I started to wonder if Eric had been telling the truth. If Joan had pulled the same stunt on him, and if she thought she could do it again because no one had ever pushed back hard enough. I went back to my unit and pulled out my laptop. I pay off debt every month, and one bogus collection notice could ruin months of progress. I could not let this slide. I logged into the Beacon Hill Estates resident portal and searched for the violation history. My account showed 0 prior violations. I checked the guest parking logs for the past week. The system showed my assigned spot number every single night, with entry timestamps that matched my work schedule. I screenshot everything and saved it to a folder. Then I went looking for the old case. The portal had a public records section where you could request past meeting minutes, financials, and enforcement logs. I submitted a request for all towing authorizations from the past 3 years, plus any violation notices tied to guest parking code G14. The system said my request would be processed within 10 business days. I did not have 10 business days. I had less than 18 hours. I called the management company that handles Beacon Hill Estates. A woman named Diane answered and told me she could not discuss individual violations without written authorization from the board. I asked her if Joan had the authority to authorize tows without board approval. Diane hesitated, then said that gate access administrators could issue notices, but towing required a second signature from either the president or the property manager. I asked her if my current notice had 2 signatures. She put me on hold. When she came back, her voice was quieter. She said the notice on file showed only 1 signature, Joan's. She said she would follow up with the board and get back to me. I hung up and felt the first flicker of hope. If Joan had issued the tow authorization without proper approval, then the whole thing was invalid. But that did not explain why she was so confident. She had to know the rules, unless she had been doing this long enough that no one ever checked. I called my ally, a local attorney I know through family named Greg. He does landlord-tenant work and has dealt with HOA disputes before. I told him what was happening and asked if he could help me draft a response. He said he could, but he warned me that fighting an HOA was expensive and slow. He said the fastest way to stop a tow was to pay under protest and sue later, but I told him I did not have the cash to float a bogus fine. Greg sighed and said he would look at the notice. He told me to send him everything I had, including the portal screenshots and the enforcement request. He said if the violation was procedurally flawed, we might be able to get an emergency injunction, but that would require filing in court tomorrow morning and I would need to show up. I told him I had a work shift tomorrow at noon and if my car was towed I would get fired. He said he understood, and he would do what he could. I stayed up until midnight, combing through old forum posts and neighborhood Facebook groups. I found a thread from 2 years ago where Eric had posted about his tow. He said he had doorbell camera footage proving the notice was never delivered when the HOA claimed. He said Joan told him the notice was hand-delivered at 10 in the morning, but his camera showed no one approaching his door until 2 in the afternoon, when a different staff member dropped off a second copy. By then, the tow truck was already on site. Eric had tried to fight it, but the board said the camera angle was inconclusive, and the tow company confirmed they had received proper authorization. He paid the fees and gave up. The thread had dozens of replies, most of them from people saying the HOA was corrupt, but no one wanted to risk retaliation by speaking up. I saved the thread and sent it to Greg. Then, I found Eric's name in the county property records and saw that he had sold his unit 14 months ago. I tried to find his contact info, but he had scrubbed his social media after the sale. Dead end. But the thread gave me an idea. If Joan had used the same tactic on Eric, she had probably used it on others. And if the notices all had the same procedural flaws, then there was a pattern. I just had to find the proof. The next morning, I woke up at 6 and checked the parking lot from my window. No tow truck yet. I got dressed and drove to the management company office, which opened at 7. I wanted to see the original authorization paperwork before Joan had a chance to clean it up. Diane was at the front desk when I walked in. She looked surprised to see me. I told her I needed to see the tow authorization for my unit. She said she could not release it without board approval, but I could file a formal records request and wait the standard 10 days. I told her I did not have 10 days. I told her the notice on file was missing a required signature, and if they proceeded with the tow, I would file a lawsuit against the management company for enabling illegal enforcement. Diane's expression shifted. She looked at her computer, clicked a few things, and then stood up. She said she needed to check with her supervisor. She disappeared into a back office and I heard muffled voices. A few minutes later, a man in a polo shirt came out and introduced himself as the property manager, Kyle. Kyle said he had reviewed my file and confirmed that the tow authorization was incomplete. He said it should have been countersigned by him or the board president, but Joan had submitted it directly to the tow company, using an old vendor contact. He said the tow company should have caught it, but they had a new dispatcher who did not know the protocol. I asked him if that meant the tow was canceled. He said yes, effective immediately. He apologized for the confusion and said he would send Joan a reminder about proper procedures. I felt a surge of relief, but also frustration. A reminder. That was it. No consequences, no follow-up, no acknowledgement that Joan had tried to extort $200 from me over a fake violation. I kept my voice low, because my trump card needed perfect timing. I thanked Kyle and asked if I could get a copy of the incomplete authorization for my records. He hesitated, then printed it out and handed it to me. The signature line for the second approver was blank. The date was 2 days ago. The tow company name was one I did not recognize. I asked Kyle if Beacon Hill Estates had changed tow vendors recently. He said no, they had used the same company for 5 years. I showed him the name on the authorization. He frowned and said he had never heard of them. He said Joan must have contacted a different vendor without telling him. That was when I knew this was bigger than one bad notice. Joan was not just bending the rules. She was running her own shadow enforcement system, using vendors that the management company did not even know about. I asked Kyle if he could pull all tow authorizations Joan had submitted in the past 3 years. He said that would require a formal audit and board approval. I told him I had already filed a records request and I would be following up with the board directly. Kyle looked uncomfortable. He said he would pass my concerns along, but he could not promise anything. I thanked him and left. I went to work that afternoon and tried to focus, but my mind kept running through the evidence. The incomplete authorization, the unknown tow vendor, the outdated violation code, Eric's story. It all pointed to the same conclusion. Joan had been running this scheme for years, targeting residents who were unlikely to fight back, pocketing fees or leveraging the threat of towing to get what she wanted. But I still did not have hard proof. I needed the old records. I needed to see if Joan had pulled the same stunt on Eric and others. And I needed to do it before she realized I was digging. After my shift, I went to the county clerk's office and filed a public records request for all HOA enforcement actions filed with the county over the past 5 years. Montana has strong open records laws, and HOAs are required to submit copies of any enforcement actions that result in liens or legal disputes. It would take a week to process, but it was a backup plan in case the association stonewalled me. Then I went back to the neighborhood and started knocking on doors. I did not have a lot of time, so I focused on the units near the guest parking area where Eric had been towed. I asked neighbors if they remembered the incident or if they had ever had issues with Joan. Most people were polite but evasive. A few said they had heard rumors but did not want to get involved. One guy said Joan had threatened him with a fine for leaving his trash can out past noon, even though the rules said pickup could run until 2. He paid the fine to avoid a fight. I was about to give up when I knocked on the door of a unit 2 buildings over. A woman in her 60s answered. Her name was Linda. She said she remembered Eric, and she remembered the tow. She said she had been walking her dog that morning and saw the tow truck arrive. She said Eric came running out, waving his phone and shouting that he had proof the notice was fake. The driver called Joan, and Joan arrived 10 minutes later in her golf cart, with the blinking amber light. Linda said Joan told the driver that Eric was lying, and the notice had been delivered properly. She said Eric showed the driver his doorbell camera footage, but Joan interrupted and said the camera angle did not show the full porch, and the notice could have been placed outside the frame. The driver shrugged and hooked up the car. I asked Linda if she would be willing to go on record with what she saw. She hesitated. She said she did not want Joan coming after her. I told her I understood, but if she changed her mind, I would protect her identity as much as I could. Linda thought for a moment, then said she would think about it. She gave me her phone number and told me to call her if I needed anything. She said Eric was a good guy and what happened to him was wrong. I thanked her and left. I had a witness, even if she was reluctant. That was progress. That night, I got an email from the resident portal. My records request had been denied. The reason given was that the requested documents contained proprietary vendor information and releasing them would violate the association's confidentiality agreements. I was told I could appeal to the board at the next meeting, which was 3 weeks away. I forwarded the email to Greg. He called me an hour later and said the denial was garbage. He said HOA enforcement records are not proprietary, and the association could not hide behind confidentiality clauses to block a legitimate records request. He said I should file a formal appeal and threaten legal action if they did not comply. Greg also said he had been looking into the tow vendor Joan used. The company name on the incomplete authorization did not match any registered tow services in Missoula. He said it was possible Joan had used a front name or contacted a driver directly, bypassing the normal vendor process. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant Joan might be pocketing part of the tow fees herself, or she might be using unlicensed drivers who did not ask questions. Either way, it was illegal. I felt a chill. If Joan was running an off-the-books towing racket, then Eric and I were not the only victims. There could be dozens of people who paid fees to a fake vendor and never got their money back. I asked Greg what I should do next. He said I needed to get the portal audit log. Every HOA resident portal keeps a record of who uploads documents, who views them, and who deletes them. If Joan or someone else had deleted records after I submitted my request, the log would show it. I asked him how I could get the log. He said I would have to request it directly from the portal vendor, which was a third-party software company. He said they would probably refuse without a subpoena, but it was worth trying. I logged into the portal and found the vendor contact page. I sent an email explaining that I was a resident investigating potential record tampering and I needed access to the audit log for my account. I cited Montana's open records laws and said I would escalate to legal action if necessary. I did not expect a response, but 2 hours later, the vendor replied. They said they could not provide individual audit logs without a court order, but they could confirm whether any records had been deleted from my account in the past 30 days. They said if I suspected tampering, I should file a complaint with the HOA board and copy them on the correspondence. I wrote back and asked them to confirm if any records had been deleted. They replied the next morning. My uploads were deleted after receipt. I called Greg immediately. He said the audit log confirmation was huge. If Joan or someone else had deleted my records request uploads after the system received them, that was evidence of tampering and obstruction. He said we could use it to force the board to investigate, and if they refused, we could go to the state attorney general's office. Greg also said he had tracked down the tow company Joan used. It was not a registered business. The phone number on the authorization traced back to a personal cell phone registered to a guy named Dale, who had a history of unlicensed towing complaints in 3 counties. Dale had been fined twice by the state transportation department for operating without proper insurance. I asked Greg if we could get Dale to talk. He said it was unlikely, but if we could prove Joan hired him knowing he was unlicensed, then she was on the hook for fraud, and the association could be liable for damages. Greg said the next step was to confront Joan directly, but not in private. He said I needed to do it in a public setting where other residents and board members could witness it. He said the best opportunity would be the next board meeting, but that was still 3 weeks away and I could not wait that long. I told him about Linda, the neighbor who saw Eric's tow. Greg said if Linda would testify, we could use her statement to build a case for an emergency board meeting. He said I should also try to find Eric and get his doorbell footage, even if it was 2 years old. I spent the next 2 days trying to track down Eric. I found his old employer through LinkedIn and called them. They said he had moved to Bozeman and left no forwarding contact. I tried the Bozeman property records, but his name did not show up. Dead end again. But I did not give up. I posted in the old Facebook thread asking if anyone had stayed in touch with Eric. A woman named Sarah replied and said she had his email. She sent it to me, and I wrote to Eric explaining what was happening and asking if he still had his doorbell footage. Eric replied the next day. He said he did have the footage, and he would send it to me. He said he was glad someone was finally going after Joan. He said he had tried to fight back, but the board shut him down and he ran out of money. He said he hoped I had better luck. The footage arrived that afternoon. It was a 2-hour clip from Eric's doorbell camera, time-stamped the morning of his tow. I watched the whole thing. No one approached his door until 1:53 in the afternoon, when a young guy in a Beacon Hill Estates polo shirt walked up and taped a second notice to the frame. The tow truck had arrived at 11:30. The footage was perfect. It proved Joan had lied about when the notice was delivered. It also showed the tow truck arriving hours before any valid notice was posted, which meant the whole thing was premeditated. I saved the footage and sent a copy to Greg. He said it was smoking gun evidence and we should use it to force an emergency meeting with the board. He said he would draft a formal complaint and file it with the board president and the management company. 2 days later, I got a response from the board, not from the president, but from Joan. She sent an email saying my complaint had been reviewed and dismissed due to lack of evidence. She said Eric's footage was inadmissible because it was too old and the camera angle was inconclusive. She said my records request had been properly denied under the association's confidentiality policy, and if I continued to harass the board, I would be subject to fines for violating the Community Conduct Code. I stared at the email. Joan was doubling down. She was not just denying the evidence, she was threatening me with more fines if I kept pushing. I forwarded the email to Greg. He called me 10 minutes later and said Joan had just made a huge mistake. He said her response constituted retaliation, and if we could prove she was targeting me for filing a legitimate complaint, we could sue her and the Association for Civil Rights Violations. Greg said we needed to escalate immediately. He said I should go to the management company in person and demand a meeting with Kyle and the board president. He said I should bring printed copies of Eric's footage, the incomplete tow authorization, the audit log confirmation, and Joan's retaliation email. He said I should also bring a witness. I called Linda and asked if she would come with me. She hesitated, then said yes. She said she was tired of Joan getting away with this, and if I was willing to fight, she would back me up. The next morning, Linda and I drove to the management company office. Kyle was not there, but Diane said she could schedule a meeting for later that day. I told her it could not wait. I told her I had evidence of fraud, retaliation, and record tampering, and if she did not get Kyle on the phone right now, I would go straight to the police. Diane looked rattled. She called Kyle and he agreed to come in. 30 minutes later, Kyle arrived with the board president, a guy named Tom who I had never met. Tom was in his 50s, balding, wearing a polo shirt and khakis. He looked annoyed. We sat down in a conference room. I laid out the evidence one piece at a time. The incomplete tow authorization. The audit log confirmation showing my uploads were deleted. Eric's doorbell footage proving the notice was never delivered when Joan claimed. The unlicensed tow driver. Joan's retaliation email. Tom listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said he would need to review the evidence with the board before making any decisions. I told him that was not good enough. I told him Joan was running a scam, and if the board did not act, I would file a complaint with the state attorney general and the county sheriff. Tom's expression hardened. He said the board took all complaints seriously, but I could not expect immediate action without due process. I told him due process did not include deleting evidence and threatening residents with retaliation. Linda spoke up. She said she had seen Joan lie to a tow driver 2 years ago, and she was willing to testify if necessary. She said the board had ignored Eric's complaint because no one wanted to believe Joan was corrupt, but the evidence was clear now and they could not keep pretending. Tom looked at Linda, then back at me. He said he would schedule an emergency board meeting for the end of the week. He said Joan would be asked to respond to the allegations, and if the evidence supported my claims, the board would take appropriate action. I asked him what appropriate action meant. He said he could not promise anything until the meeting, but he assured me the board would follow the rules. I did not trust him, but I had no choice. I thanked him and left. The next 3 days were agony. I kept waiting for Joan to retaliate again, but nothing happened. No new notices, no tow threats, no emails. It was like she was waiting to see what the board would do. The emergency meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at the community center. I arrived early with Greg and Linda. A few other residents were already there, including Sarah, the woman who had helped me find Eric. She said she had heard about the meeting and wanted to see what happened. Joan arrived 10 minutes before the meeting started. She was wearing her pink windbreaker and her gray bucket hat, even though we were indoors. She ignored me completely and sat down at the front table with Tom and 2 other board members I did not recognize. The meeting started at 7. Tom read a prepared statement saying the board had received serious allegations against Joan Collins, the gate access administrator, and the meeting was being held to review the evidence and determine next steps. He said Joan would have the opportunity to respond, and the board would vote on any recommended actions. Tom asked me to present my evidence. I stood up and walked to the front. I had prepared 2 binders, one for the board and one for the room to see. I placed one on the table in front of Tom and opened the other so everyone could follow along. I started with the incomplete tow authorization. I explained that Joan had submitted it to an unlicensed tow driver without the required second signature, violating the association's own enforcement policy. I showed the board the document with the blank signature line. Joan interrupted. She said the authorization was not incomplete, it was pending approval, and the tow company had jumped the gun by showing up early. She said she had called them to cancel the tow as soon as she realized the paperwork was not finalized. I asked her why she told me the tow was already authorized, and I had no choice but to pay. She said she had been mistaken and apologized for the confusion. I did not believe her, and I could tell the board did not either. Tom asked her to let me finish. I moved on to Eric's doorbell footage. I played the clip on my laptop with the screen projected onto the wall so everyone could see. The timestamp was clear. No one approached Eric's door until 1:53 in the afternoon. The tow truck arrived at 11:30. Joan said the footage was taken out of context. She said the notice had been hand-delivered earlier in the morning, but Eric had removed it before the camera recorded it. She said the second notice was a courtesy follow-up. Linda stood up and said that was a lie. She said she had been walking her dog that morning and saw the tow truck arrive. She said Eric came running out with no notice in his hand, and Joan told the driver to proceed even after Eric showed his camera footage. Joan turned to Linda and said, "This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive. You were not involved in the incident and your testimony is irrelevant." Linda did not back down. She said she saw what she saw and Joan could not bully her into silence. Tom asked Joan to stop interrupting. He asked me to continue. I showed the audit log confirmation. I explained that I had uploaded my records request to the portal, and the vendor confirmed my uploads were deleted after receipt. I said the only people with access to delete records were Joan and the management company staff. Kyle, who was sitting in the back, stood up and said his staff did not delete anything. He said if records were deleted, it had to be Joan. Joan said the portal had a glitch, and sometimes files were auto-deleted if they exceeded the size limit. She said she had notified the vendor and they were working on a fix. I asked her why the vendor did not mention a glitch when I contacted them. She said she did not know, and I should take it up with the vendor. Tom asked her if she had any proof of the glitch. She said she did not, but she was confident it was a technical issue and not tampering. Tom looked skeptical. He asked me if I had anything else. I pulled out my trump card. I said I had one more piece of evidence, and it was the most important. I said I had gone to the management company lobby earlier that week and confronted Kyle about the tow authorization. I said Kyle confirmed the authorization was incomplete and Joan had used an unlicensed tow driver. I said I had recorded the entire conversation on my phone. The room went silent. Joan's face went pale. Tom asked me if I had the recording with me. I pulled out my phone and played it. Kyle's voice was clear. He said the tow authorization was incomplete. He said Joan had submitted it directly to a driver he had never heard of. He said the association's normal tow vendor was never contacted. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA drama and neighborhood justice. Joan stood up and said the recording was illegal. She said I had no right to record a private conversation without consent, and the recording should be thrown out. Greg, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up and said Montana is a one-party consent state, which means I had every right to record a conversation I was part of. He said the recording was admissible, and if Joan wanted to challenge it, she would have to do so in court. Tom asked Joan to sit down. He asked her if she had anything to say in her defense. Joan took a deep breath and said she had been trying to enforce the rules fairly, and if she made mistakes, they were honest mistakes. She said I was targeting her because I did not like being held accountable, and the board should not let one resident undermine the entire enforcement system. Tom said the board would deliberate and vote. He asked everyone to leave the room except the board members. Linda, Greg, and I waited outside. I could hear muffled voices through the door, but I could not make out what they were saying. After 20 minutes, Tom called us back in. Tom said the board had reviewed the evidence and concluded that Joan had violated multiple association policies, including the tow authorization process, the records retention policy, and the anti-retaliation policy. He said the board was recommending that Joan step down from her position as gate access administrator, effective immediately. Joan shot to her feet and said she would not step down. She said the board had no authority to remove her without a formal hearing and a vote of the membership. She said this was a witch hunt, and she would fight it. Tom said the board did have the authority to remove appointed officers for cause, and the evidence clearly showed cause. He said Joan could appeal to the membership at the next annual meeting, but until then, she was suspended from all HOA duties. Joan grabbed her papers and stormed out. The golf cart with the blinking amber light was waiting for her in the parking lot, but she did not get in. She walked to her car and drove away. Tom said the board would also be conducting a full audit of all tow authorizations Joan had submitted over the past 5 years. He said if the audit uncovered additional violations, the association would refund any improper fees and terminate its relationship with any unlicensed vendors. I asked Tom what would happen to the records I had requested. He said the board would reopen my request and provide full access to all enforcement logs and vendor contracts. He said the portal vendor would be required to restore any deleted files and provide a complete audit log. Tom also said the board would be reviewing the association's enforcement policies to prevent future abuses. He said residents would have the right to appeal any violation notice before a tow was authorized, and all tow vendors would be required to verify authorization with the management company before proceeding. I thanked Tom and the board. Linda hugged me and said she was proud of me for standing up to Joan. Greg shook my hand and said I had done everything right. Sarah came up and said she was going to post about the meeting in the neighborhood Facebook group. She said other residents deserved to know what Joan had been doing, and the board needed to be held accountable for letting it go on so long. Over the next 2 weeks, the audit results came in. Joan had submitted 43 tow authorizations over 5 years. 18 of them were incomplete or improperly signed. 7 of them used unlicensed drivers. The total amount of improper fees collected was over $12,000. The board voted to refund every cent. They also voted to terminate Joan's access to the resident portal and the gate control system. She was banned from serving in any HOA capacity for 5 years. The association also filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office. Joan was investigated for fraud and obstruction, and she eventually agreed to a settlement that included paying a fine and surrendering her HOA credentials permanently. Eric got his money back, plus interest. Linda was recognized at the next annual meeting for her courage in speaking up. The board implemented a written records production schedule that Joan could not interfere with, and they hired a third-party auditor to review enforcement actions every quarter. The HOA stopped selective enforcement after complaints piled up. Residents started attending meetings again. The golf cart with the blinking amber light was decommissioned and sold to a landscaping company. Joan tried to spin the story on social media, claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy, but no one believed her. She moved out of Beacon Hill Estates 6 months later. I stayed. My car was never threatened again. My debt got paid off on schedule. And every time I walked past the spot where Joan used to park her golf cart, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing the cold case was finally closed. Take care, and I will catch you in the next one.